A Story of the Latin Quarter by Francis Hodgson Burnett. He is one of the Americans, his fellow locataires said among themselves. Poor and alone and in bad health. A queer fellow. Having made this reply to those who questioned them, they were in the habit of dismissing the subject lightly. After all, it was nothing to them, since he had never joined their circle. They were a gay, good-natured lot, and made a point of regarding life as airily as possible, and taking each day as it came with fantastic good cheer. The house, which stood in one of the shabbiest corners of the Latin Quarter, was full of them from floor to garret, artists, students, models, French, English, Americans, living all of them merrily, by no means the most regular of lives. But there were good friends among them, their world was their own, and they found plenty of sympathy in their loves and quarrels, their luck and ill luck. Upon the whole there was more ill luck than luck. Lucky men did not choose for their headquarters such places as this rather dilapidated building. They could afford to go elsewhere, to places where the quarter was better, where the stairs were less rickety, the passages less dark, and the concierge not given to chronic intoxication. Here came the unlucky ones, whose ill luck was of various orders and degrees, the young ones who were some day to paint pictures which would be seen in the Palais de l'Industrie and would be greeted with acclamations by an appreciative public, the older ones who had painted pictures which had been seen at the Palais de l'Industrie and had not been appreciated at all, the poets whose sonnets were of too subtle an order to reach the common herd, the students who had lived beyond the means allowed them by their highly respectable families, and who were consequently somewhat off color in the eyes of the respectable families in question, these and others of the same class, all more or less poor, more or less out at elbows, and more or less in debt. And yet, as I have said, they lived gaily. They painted, and admired or criticized each other's pictures, they lent and borrowed with equal freedom, they bemoaned their wrongs loudly, and sang and laughed more loudly still as the mood seized them, and any special ill fortune befalling one of their number generally aroused a display of sympathy which, though it might not last long, was always a source of consolation to the luckless one. But the American, notwithstanding he had been in the house for months, had never become one of them. He had been seen in the early spring going up the stairway to his room, which was a mere garret on the 6th story. And it had been expected among them that in a day or so he would present himself for inspection. But this he did not do, and when he encountered any of their number in his outgoings or incomings he returned their greetings gently in imperfect French. He spoke slowly and with difficulty, but there was no coldness in his voice or manners, and yet none got much further than the greeting. He was a young fellow, scarcely of middle height, frail in figure, hollow-chested, and with a gentle face and soft, deeply set dark eyes. That he worked hard and lived barely it was easy enough to discover. Part of each day he spent in the various art galleries, and after his return from these visits he was seen no more until the following morning. Until the last ray of light disappears he is at his easel, said a young student whom a gay escapade had temporarily banished to the 5th floor. I hear him move now and then and cough. He has a villainous cough. He is one of the enthusiasts, said another. One can read it in his face. What fools they are, these enthusiasts. They throw away life that a crown of laurel may be laid upon their coffins. In the summer some of them managed to leave Paris, and the rest had enough to do to organize their little excursions and make the best of the sunshine, shade and warmth. But when those who had been away returned and all settled down for the winter, they found the American, as they called him, in his old place. He had not been away at all, he had worked as hard as ever through midsummer heat and autumn rain, he was frailer in figure, his clothes were more worn, his face was thinner and his eyes far too hollow and bright, but he did not look either discouraged or unhappy. How does he live? Exclaimed the concierge dramatically. The good God knows. He eats nothing, he has no fire, he wears the clothing of midsummer, he paints, he paints, he paints. Perhaps that is enough for him. It would not be for me. At this time, just as the winter entered with bleak winds and rains and falls of powdery snow, there presented herself among them an arrival whose appearance created a sensation. One night on his way upstairs, the American found himself confronted on the 4th floor by a flood of light streaming through the open door of a before unoccupied room. It was a small room, meagerly furnished, but there was a fire in it and half a dozen people who laughed and talked at the top of their voices. 5 of them were men he had seen before, artists who lived in the house, but the 6th was a woman whom he had never seen and whose marvelous beauty held him spellbound where he stood. She was a woman of 22 or 3, with an oval face whose fairness was the fairness of ivory. She was dark-eyed and low-browed, and as she leaned forward upon the table and looked up at the man who spoke to her, even the bright glow of the lamp, which burned directly before her face, showed no flaw in either tint or outline. "Why should we ask the reason of your return?" said the man. "Let us rejoice that you are here." "I will tell you the reason," she answered, without lowering her eyes. "I was tired." "A good reason," was the reply. She pushed her chair back and stood upright, her hands hung at her side. The men were all looking at her. She smiled down at them with fine irony. "Who among you wishes to paint me?" she said. "I am again at your service, and I am not less handsome than I was." Then there arose among them a little rapturous murmur, and somehow it broke the spell which had rested upon the man outside. He started, shivered slightly and turned away. He went up to the bare coldness of his own room and sat down, forgetting that it was either cold or bare. Suddenly, as he had looked at the woman's upturned face, a great longing had seized upon him. "I should like to paint you, he found himself saying to the silence about him. "If I might paint you." He heard the next day who she was. The concierge was ready enough to give him more information than he had asked. "Mademoiselle Natalie, Monsieur means," he said, "a handsome girl a celebrated model. They all know her. Her face has been the foundation of more than one great picture. There are not many like her. One model has this beauty, another that, but she, mon Dieu, she has all. A great creature, mademoiselle." Afterward, as the days went by, he found that she sat often to the other artists. Sometimes he saw her as she went to their rooms or came away, sometimes he caught a glimpse of her as he passed her open door, and each time there stirred afresh within him the longing he had felt at first. So it came about that one afternoon, as she came out of a studio in which she had been giving a sitting, she found waiting outside for her the thinly clad, frail figure of the American. He made an eager yet hesitant step forward, and began to speak awkwardly in French. She stopped him. "Speak English," she said, "I know it well." "Thank you," he answered simply, "that is a great relief. My French is so bad. I am here to ask a great favor from you, and I am sure I could not ask it well in French." "What is the favor?" she inquired, looking at him with some wonder. He was a new type to her, with his quiet directness of speech and his gentle manner. "I have heard that you are a professional model," he replied, "and I have wished very much to paint what I see in your face. I have wished it from the first hour I saw you. The desire haunts me. But I am a very poor man, I have almost nothing, I cannot pay you what the rest do. Today I came to the desperate resolve that I would throw myself upon your mercy, that I would ask you to sit to me, and wait until better fortune comes." She stood still a moment and gazed at him. "Monsieur," she said at length, "are you so poor as that?" He colored a little, but it was not as if with shame. "Yes," he answered, "I am very poor. I have asked a great deal of you, have I not?" She gave him still another long look. "No," she said, "I will come to you tomorrow, if you will direct me to your room." "It is on the 6th floor," he replied, "the highest of all. It is a bare little place." "I will come," she said, and was turning away when he stopped her. I should like to tell you how grateful I am," he began. "There is no need," she responded with bitter lightness. "You will pay me some day, when you are a great artist." But when she reached the next landing she glanced down and saw that he still stood beneath watching her. The next day she kept her word and went to him. She found his room poorer and barer even than she had fancied it might be. The ceiling was low and slanting, in one corner stood a narrow iron bedstead, in another a wooden table, in the best light the small window gave his easel was placed with a chair before it. When he had opened the door in answer to her summons, and she saw all this, she glanced quickly at his face to see if there was any shade of confusion upon it, but there was none. He appeared only rejoiced and eager. "I felt sure it was you," he said. "Were you then so sure that I would come?" she asked. "You said you would," he answered. He placed her as he wished to paint her, and then sat down to his work. In a few moments he was completely absorbed in it. For a long time he did not speak at all. The utter silence which reigned, a silence which was not only a suspension of speech but a suspension of any other thought beyond his task, was a new experience to her. His cheek flushed, his eyes burned dark and bright, it seemed as if he scarcely breathed. When he turned to look at her she was conscious each time of a sudden thrill of feeling. More than once he paused for several moments, brush and palette in hand, simply watching her face. At one of these pauses she herself broke the silence. "Why do you look at me so?" she asked. "You look at me as if," and she broke off with an uneasy little laugh. He roused himself with a slight start and colored sensitively, passing his hand across his forehead. "What I want to paint is not always in your face," he answered. "Sometimes I lose it, and then I must wait a little until I find it again. It is not only your face I want, it is yourself." And he made a sudden unconscious gesture with his hands. She tried to laugh again, hard and lightly as before, but failed. "Myself," she said. "Mon Dieu! Do not grasp at me, monsieur. It will not pay you. Paint my flesh, my hair, my eyes, they are good, but do not paint me." He looked troubled. "I am afraid my saying that sounded stilted," he returned. "I explained myself poorly. It is not easy for me to explain myself well." "I understood," she said, "and I have warned you." They did not speak to each other again during the whole sitting except once, when he asked her if she was warm enough. "I have a fire today," he said. "Have you not always a fire?" she asked. "No," he answered with a smile, "but when you come here there will always be one." "Then," she said, "I will come often, that I may save you from death." "Oh," he replied, "it is easier than you think to forget that one is cold." "Yes," she returned. "And it is easier than you think for one to die." When she was going away, she made a movement toward the easel, but he stopped her. "Not yet," he said. "Not just yet." She drew back. "I have never cared to look at myself before," she said. "I do not know why I should care now. Perhaps," with the laugh again, "it is that I wish to see what you will make of me." Afterward, as she sat over her little porcelain stove in her room below, she scarcely comprehended her own mood. "He is not like the rest," she said. "He knows nothing of the world. He is one of the good. He cares only for his art. How simple, and kind, and pure. The little room is like a saint's cell." And then, suddenly, she flung her arms out wearily, with a heavy sigh. "Ah, Dieu," she said, "how dull the day is. The skies are lead." A few days later she gave a sitting to an old artist whose name was Masson, and she found that he had heard of what had happened. "And so you sit to the American," he said. "Yes. Well, and you find him?" "I find him," she repeated after him. "Shall I tell you what I find him? I shall listen with delight. I find him, a soul. You and I, my friend, and the rest of us, are bodies, he is a soul." The artist began to whistle softly as he painted. "It is dangerous work," he said at length, "for women to play with souls." "That is true," she answered, coldly. The same day she went again to the room on the 6th floor. She again sat through an hour of silence in which the American painted eagerly, now and then stopping to regard her with searching eyes. "But not as the rest regard me," she said to herself. "He forgets that it is a woman who sits here. He sees only what he would paint." As time went by, this fact, which she always felt, was in itself a fascination. In the chill, calm atmosphere of the place there was repose for her. She found nothing to resent, nothing to steel herself against, she need no longer think of herself at all. She had time to think of the man in whose presence she sat. From the first she had seen something touching in his slight stooping figure, thin young face and dark womanish eyes, and after she had heard the simple uneventful history of his life, she found them more touching still. He was a New Englander, the last surviving representative of a frail and short-lived family. His parents had died young, leaving him quite alone, with a mere pittance to depend upon, and throughout his whole life he had cherished but one aim. "When I was a child I used to dream of coming here," he said, "and as I grew older I worked and struggled for it. I knew I must gain my end some day, and the time came when it was gained. And this is the end?" she asked, glancing round at the poor place. "This is all of life you desire?" He did not look up at her. "It is all I have," he answered. She wondered if he would not ask her some questions regarding herself, but he did not. He does not care to know, she thought sullenly. And then she told herself that he did know, and a mocking devil of a smile settled on her lip and was there when he turned toward her again. But the time never came when his manner altered, when he was less candid and gentle, or less grateful for the favor she was bestowing upon him. She scarcely knew how it was that she first began to know the sound of his foot upon the stairway and to listen for it. Her earliest consciousness of it was when once she awakened suddenly out of a dead sleep at night and found herself sitting upright with her hand upon her heavily throbbing heart. "What is it?" she cried in a loud whisper. But she spoke only to herself and the darkness. She knew what it was and did not lie down again until the footsteps had reached the top of the last flight and the door above had opened and closed. The time arrived when there was scarcely a trifling incident in his everyday life which escaped her. She saw each sign of his poverty and physical weakness. He grew paler day by day. There were days when his step flagged as he went up and down the staircase, some mornings he did not go out at all. She discovered that each Sunday he went twice to the little American chapel in the Rue de Berry, and she had seen in his room a small Protestant Bible. "You read that?" she asked him when she first saw it. "Yes." She leaned forward, her look curious, bewildered, even awed. "And you believe in God?" "Yes." She resumed her former position, but she did not remove her eyes from his face, and unconsciously she put her hand up to her swelling throat. When at length the sitting was over and she left her chair, he was standing before the easel. He turned to her and spoke hesitantly. "Will you come and look at it?" he asked. She went and stood where he bade her, and looked. He watched her anxiously while she did so. For the first moment there was amazement in her face, then some mysterious emotion he could not comprehend. A dull red crept slowly over brow and cheek. She turned upon him. "Monsieur," she cried, passionately. "You mock me. It is a bad picture." He fell back a pace, staring at her and suddenly trembling with the shock. "A bad picture," he echoed. "I mock you, I. It is my face," she said, pointing to it, "but you have made it what I am not. It is the face of a good woman, of a woman who might be a saint. Does not that mock me?" He turned to it with a troubled, dreamy look. "It is what I have seen in your face," he said in a soft, absent voice. "It is a truth to me. It is what I have seen. It is what no other has seen," she said. "I tell you it mocks me." "It need not mock you," he answered. "I could not have painted it if I had not felt it. It is yourself, yourself." "Myself," she said. "Do you think, monsieur, that the men who have painted me before would know it?" She gave it another glance and a shrill laugh burst from her, but the next instant it broke off and ended in another sound. She fell upon her knees by the empty chair, her open hands flung outward, her sobs strangling her. He stood quite near her, looking down. "I have not thought of anything but my work," he said. "Why should I?" The following Sunday night the artist Masson met in going downstairs a closely veiled figure coming up. He knew it and spoke. "What, Natalie?" he said. "You. One might fancy you had been to church." "I have been," she returned in a cold voice, "to the Church of the Americans in the Rue de Berry." He shrugged his shoulders. "Has it done you good?" he asked. "No," she answered, and walked past him, leaving him to look after her and think the matter over. She went to her own apartment and locked herself in. Having done so, she lighted every candle and lamp, flooding the place with a garish mockery of brightness. She sang as she did it, a gay, shrill air from some opera bouffe.